I used to think that love was enough to make things work, that if you found the right person, everything else would fall into place. But looking back now, I can see all the cracks that were there from the start, cracks I ignored because I wanted so badly to believe in the version of us I had in my head. I met Kate when I was 22, in my last year of university. She was 24, smart, funny, and had this way of making everyone around her feel like they were the most important person in the room. She wasn't just beautiful, she was magnetic. We met at a friend's party, one of those overcrowded, too loud college gatherings where you end up talking to random people just to escape the chaos. She was sitting on the kitchen counter, laughing at some terrible joke someone told, and when our eyes met, she smiled like she already knew me. That was it for me. We started hanging out, first in groups, then just the two of us. We'd stay up late talking about everything, our dreams, our families, the kind of lives we wanted to build. She was easy to talk to, easy to be around, and when we finally started dating, it felt like I'd won some kind of cosmic lottery. For the first few months, everything was perfect. We traveled when we could, found little hole-in-the-wall restaurants to claim as our spot, and made plans for a future that felt both exciting and completely possible. But then there was the one thing. She told me early on, casually, like it wasn't a big deal, that she planned to wait until marriage to have sex. Not because she was personally religious, but because her family was. Her dad was a well-known pastor in our city, and she'd been raised in a household where purity was everything. She didn't believe in it herself. Not really, but she couldn't shake the guilt, the feeling that if she crossed that line, she'd be disappointing people who had spent their whole lives shaping her beliefs. I told her I understood, and at the time I thought I did. I told myself it wasn't a big deal, that relationships were about more than sex, and that if everything else was great, I could wait. And for a while, I really believed that. The first year was fine. It wasn't easy, but we found ways to be close without crossing her boundaries. There was plenty of teasing, a lot of making out, and even some moments where I thought, maybe, just maybe, she was reconsidering. But she never did. The second things got too heated, she'd pull back. "I can't," she'd say, looking guilty like she was letting me down. "Not until we're married." At first, I respected it. Then I tolerated it. Then, slowly, I started resenting it. It wasn't just about sex. It was about how it made me feel. Like I was always pushing for something I wasn't allowed to have. Like I was wrong for even wanting it. And worse, like she held all the power in the relationship. Because while I was constantly suppressing what I wanted, she never had to. She was completely in control, and I was just supposed to be okay with that. I started noticing little things. How she would use it as leverage, how arguments always ended with her making me feel guilty, even when I hadn't done anything wrong. If I got frustrated, she'd accuse me of not respecting her values. If I tried to talk about it, she'd shut down, saying I was pressuring her. It wasn't just about sex. It was a pattern, a slow, creeping realization that our relationship was always going to be on her terms. But by then, I was already in too deep. I told myself it would change, that eventually we'd get married, and this tension would disappear. That once we had that final step, everything would go back to being perfect. I had no idea how wrong I was. I don't know exactly when things shifted, but I remember the feeling, like I was standing in a room that used to feel warm and familiar, only to realize the walls were closing in. At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself that every relationship had its struggles, that waiting was just a test of patience, that love was about more than physical intimacy. But the reality was, it was eating away at me. Almost all my friends had normal relationships. Sex was just a natural part of them. And here I was stuck in this weird limbo, where everything was almost enough but never quite. We tried other things, ways to be close without actually crossing the line she refused to cross. But it was never enough for me. It always felt like I was getting scraps, like I had to be grateful for whatever she was willing to give me. And that imbalance, the way she held all the control, kept growing between us. Then came the second problem. Kate had graduated and landed a serious job in a prestigious company. She was making good money, dressing sharp, and spending her days around successful, ambitious men, and she wouldn't stop talking about them. At first, I tried not to care. It was normal to talk about work, right? But the way she spoke about these guys, their confidence, their drive, their success, it started getting under my skin. Because at the time, I was still a broke student, barely scraping by, working a part-time job that barely covered rent. And I felt it, that quiet, growing insecurity. I'd catch myself analyzing the way she talked about them, the way she laughed a little too hard when she mentioned their jokes, the way she casually slipped in details about their cars, their promotions, their expensive watches. And I'd wonder, am I enough for her? That thought sat in my chest like a weight I couldn't shake. We started arguing more, not just about the intimacy issue, but about everything. Plans for the future, money, how she saw her career versus how she saw mine. She wanted a certain lifestyle, one I wasn't sure I could provide anytime soon. And even if she never said it outright, I could feel the disappointment in the way she looked at me sometimes. Like she was waiting for me to become someone else, someone better. One night, after yet another argument that went in circles, I just knew this wasn't going to work. It wasn't just the waiting. It wasn't just the insecurity. It was everything. How we saw the future, how we handled conflict, how I felt like I was constantly the one sacrificing, compromising, making myself smaller just to fit into her world. So I did it. I sat her down, took a deep breath, and told her we needed to break up. She cried. She begged me to reconsider. She promised things would get better, that she loved me, that we could make it work. And for a second, just a second, I almost gave in, because I did love her. And ending something that had been such a huge part of my life was terrifying. But deep down, I knew this wasn't love. Not anymore. It was just a cycle I needed to break. After the breakup, I threw myself into my studies. At first, it was hard, I won't lie. Even though I knew ending things was the right choice, there were nights when I questioned it. I'd spent years with Kate. She wasn't just my girlfriend. She was woven into my routine, my thoughts, my future. But little by little, I started moving on. By the time I graduated, I had landed a solid engineering job with a starting salary of $105,000 a year. That number felt surreal after struggling through school, barely affording rent and cheap takeout. I finally had stability, real independence. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was actually going somewhere. Then, out of nowhere, Kate came back. I remember the moment I saw her name pop up on my phone. I just stared at it for a second, like my brain couldn't process it. We hadn't spoken since the breakup. No texts, no calls, nothing. I had assumed she'd moved on, just like I had. Her message was simple. Hey, can we talk? At first, I thought about ignoring it. But then curiosity got the better of me. We had spent years together, after all. Maybe she just wanted closure. Maybe I did too. So, I agreed to meet up. We met at a quiet cafe, and the second I saw her, I felt nothing. No longing, no pain, just a distant familiarity. She smiled like nothing had changed, like we were just two old friends catching up. At first, the conversation was light. She asked about my job, my life. She told me she missed me, that she had been thinking about me a lot. And then she said she wanted to get back together. I just sat there processing. I asked her the only question that mattered. Why now? At first, she hesitated. She mumbled something about realizing what we had, how she regretted letting me go. But something felt off. There was a nervous edge to her voice, like she was waiting for me to accept before giving me the full story. So I pushed. I asked her again, what changed? That's when the cracks started showing. She got defensive, said she didn't know why I was acting so cold. But I didn't back down. I kept pressing, kept asking the uncomfortable questions until she finally snapped. Fine, I was with someone else, okay? I felt my stomach drop. She admitted that after we broke up, she had started seeing her boss, Brian, 35 years old, successful, confident, the kind of guy she had always admired. She insisted he pursued her, that he was persistent, that it just happened. And then she said it. We ended up sleeping together. I stared at her, completely numb. I had waited almost 5 years. I had been patient, respectful, understanding. And Brian? He got her after just a few months. I couldn't even speak. Because at that moment, I realized something. Kate never really cared about waiting. It wasn't about her values. It wasn't about marriage. It was about control, about keeping me in a box while she kept her options open. And now that I was successful, now that I was finally doing well for myself, she wanted back in. I leaned back in my chair, exhaled slowly, and for the first time in years, I saw Kate for exactly who she was. Kate sat across from me, looking desperate. Her hands gripped the edge of the table like she was afraid I'd get up and walk away before she could convince me. It didn't mean anything, she said. I was confused. I thought I wanted something else, but I was wrong. You're the one I should be with. I just stared at her. I wanted to believe her, but my mind kept circling back to one thing. She had waited with me. For years. She had cried, begged me to understand, made me feel like sex was this sacred, untouchable thing she just couldn't do. And yet, some guy, some older, wealthier guy, pursued her and suddenly the rules changed? How? I asked, my voice colder than I expected. How could you do that with him so easily after everything you told me? Kate looked away, ashamed. I don't know. It just happened. He was persistent. I was feeling lonely, but I regretted it right after. It made me realize I didn't want anyone else. I just wanted you. I exhaled sharply, trying to control the anger bubbling inside me. I wasn't even sure what I was mad about anymore. Was it the fact that she had slept with someone else? Or was it that everything I had believed about us, everything she had made me believe, was a lie? For years, I had been patient. I had suppressed my own needs, told myself that love was about more than sex. I had convinced myself that waiting made our relationship stronger. But now I just felt like a joke, like I had been played. Kate reached across the table and grabbed my hand. We can start over, she whispered. This time, no restrictions. No waiting. The irony almost made me laugh. I told her I needed time to think. For the next few days, my mind was a war zone. Logically, I could take her back. We had history. We knew each other inside and out. Maybe what happened with Brian was just a mistake, something we could move past. If I let this go, we could finally have a normal relationship, free from all the issues that had held us back before. But emotionally, I felt used. I wasn't some backup plan. I wasn't someone she could put on hold while she explored her options, only to come running back when she realized the grass wasn't greener. And that's what it all boiled down to. She hadn't chosen me. She had chosen Brian first. And now, when that didn't work out, she wanted to rewind time and act like none of it happened. So, I made my decision. I called her and told her it was over for good. She cried, begged me to reconsider, promised me that things would be different this time. But I didn't waver, because deep down, I knew that no matter how much history we had, no matter how much I had once loved her, I deserved better. After shutting the door on Kate for good, I felt lighter. But there was still this weird emotional hangover, like my brain was trying to process years of a relationship that suddenly didn't mean what I thought it did. I knew I had made the right decision, but part of me still felt unsettled. So, when my friend suggested a weekend getaway, I jumped at the chance. We rented this insane mountain house, $900 a night, the kind of place with a huge deck overlooking the trees, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a fireplace that looked straight out of a movie. For 3 days, we did everything. We rode ATVs through the trails, found the best restaurants in town, drank expensive whiskey by the fire, and just lived. No estrés, no drama, no overthinking. Just good times with people who actually had my back. One night, we were sitting around the campfire, passing around beers, talking about life. At some point, the conversation drifted to Kate. If she hadn't texted you, one of my friends asked, would you have wanted to go back to her? The question caught me off guard. I opened my mouth to answer, but then I actually thought about it. If Kate had never messaged me, if she had just stayed in the past where she belonged, would I have ever considered going back? No. The answer hit me like a ton of bricks. I never would have reached out to her. I never would have regretted leaving. The only reason I even entertained the idea of reconciliation was because she came back. She forced herself back into my life, stirred up old emotions, and made me question something I had already moved on from. And that told me everything I needed to know. I had made the right choice from the start. The moment I walked away, that should have been it. Kate wasn't my future. She was just a chapter one had already finished. I took a long sip of my drink, leaned back in my chair, and for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. After I cut contact, Kate must have realized I wasn't coming back, because a few weeks later, I heard from a mutual friend that she had gotten back with Brian. I wasn't surprised. She texted me a few more times, little things like, "Hey, hope you're doing well," or "I miss talking to you." I ignored every single one. It was done. I wasn't going to play her game anymore. Instead, I threw myself into my new life. My job was going great, and after my first few paychecks, I finally upgraded my living situation. No more cramped apartments with paper-thin walls. I moved to a sleek, modern place in an upscale neighborhood. It was my first time truly living alone, and I loved it. No drama, no stress, just me building the life I had always wanted. Then, one night, everything changed. My roommate, before I moved out, had thrown this massive party, the kind that starts with a few friends and somehow turns into 50 people packed into a living room. I wasn't in the mood for a party, but I figured I'd stop by for a bit. And that's when I met her. Sophie. She was stunning, not just in a physical way, but in the way she carried herself. Confident, sharp, and completely in her element. She worked at a big law firm, had this razor-sharp wit, and when we started talking, it felt different. With Kate, I had always felt like I was trying to prove something, like I was working for her approval. But with Sophie, it was effortless. We talked for hours that night, long after the party had died down. And for the first time in a long time, I felt that rush again, the excitement of something real. 2 months later, we were officially together. Sophie didn't play games. She didn't make me feel like I had to earn her love or like she was waiting for something better to come along. She wanted me, and that was enough. Looking back now, I can't believe I ever thought Kate was the best I could do. Life has a funny way of showing you what you actually deserve. Sometimes, you just have to let go of the wrong person to find the right one. A few months into my relationship with Sophie, she invited me to a charity reception her firm was hosting. It was one of those fancy events with overpriced tickets, champagne that never seemed to stop flowing, and a guest list full of corporate executives and lawyers trying to out-network each other. I wasn't exactly in my element, but Sophie looked stunning in her evening dress, and honestly, I was just proud to be by her side. She was thriving in her career, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was truly with someone who was on my level. And then, out of nowhere, I saw her. Kate. She looked different. She had lost a lot of weight. Her hair was a completely new color, and she was dressed in designer clothes that screamed money. And right next to her, standing with his hand possessively on her waist, was Brian. She wasn't just with him. She was engaged. The massive diamond on her hand practically blinded me from across the room. It was the kind of ring that cost tens of thousands, the kind meant to show off status rather than love. She was smiling, laughing, proudly showing it off to people around her. For a moment, she hadn't noticed me. But then, as I walked in with Sophie, her eyes landed on us. And I saw it, the flicker of surprise, then something else. Something closer to discomfort. She hadn't expected me to be there. And she definitely hadn't expected to see me with someone like Sophie. I introduced Sophie to her casually, like Kate was just another person in the room. Sophie, ever the professional, greeted her politely, clearly sensing some weird tension but not engaging in it. Kate, on the other hand, looked like she didn't know how to process it. She plastered on a tight smile, mumbled a quick introduction, then excused herself with Brian. I didn't think much of it after that. To me, it was just a brief, awkward run-in with my past. But a few days later, things took a strange turn. Kate tried to find me. She actually went to my old house, the one I had moved out of months ago. My old roommate told me she had knocked on the door, asked about me, and seemed weirdly insistent on getting in touch. And then, as if that wasn't enough, she somehow found my new email and sent me a message. It wasn't long, but it was telling. She asked how I was doing, said it was nice seeing me again, then almost casually asked how serious my relationship with Sophie was. I didn't even hesitate. I deleted the email without replying. Whatever she wanted, curiosity, validation, maybe even a way back in, it didn't matter. I wasn't playing her games anymore. Kate was nothing more than a closed chapter in my life. And for the first time, I felt absolutely nothing when I let her go. Looking back, I see things clearly now. Kate was never truly committed to me. She was committed to keeping her options open. She wanted the security of knowing I would always be there, waiting, loyal, and patient while she figured herself out, while she tested her limits, while she made sure she wasn't missing out on something better. But here's the truth. I was never her first choice. And that's not love. Love isn't keeping someone on standby while you experiment with others. It isn't setting rules and boundaries for one person, only to toss them aside when someone more exciting comes along. It isn't treating someone like a placeholder until you decide if they're worthy of having all of you. That's not love. That's selfishness. And I refuse to be a backup plan. For the first time in years, I feel free. Free from the overanalyzing, the insecurity, the quiet resentment that built up every time I felt like I was sacrificing a part of myself just to keep Kate happy. Free from the idea that I had to earn love, that I had to be patient enough, successful enough, good enough for someone who never truly valued me. Now, I have a life I'm proud of. I have a career that pays well and gives me a sense of purpose. I have a beautiful apartment in a neighborhood I once thought was out of reach. I wake up every morning knowing I'm building something for myself, not waiting on someone else's timeline. And most importantly, I have Sophie. Sophie, who never made me feel like I had to prove my worth. Sophie, who didn't play games or dangle affection over my head like a reward I had to earn. She's ambitious, driven, and has her own goals, but she still makes room for us. With her, everything feels easy in a way it never did with Kate. The night we ran into Kate and Brian at that charity event, I expected to feel something: anger, sadness, maybe even jealousy. But when I saw them together, all I felt was nothing. She had made her choice, and so had I. Kate sent that email because she wanted to know if I was still waiting in the wings, if I was still the same guy she had left behind, the guy who would have once dropped everything to take her back. But I'm not that guy anymore. I didn't respond to her email because there was nothing left to say. I didn't know her closure. I didn't know her validation. I owe myself happiness. And for the first time I have it. Kate is just a chapter of my past, a lesson learned. Nothing more. Life moves forward. And honestly, it's never been better.